Something else that's a bit confusing about this terminology is that we have this thing called density field, but really this should probably say mask field or something like that because this doesn't have to be density. This is just used again to mask where this is allowed to happen. So anyway, it's pretty messy the way that this is set up, but now that you know, not a big deal. Okay, so in this turbulence tab, how should we dial in the settings? Well, the way I like doing this is, first of all, let's be sure that we have the multi-field on right there so that we can see our fire. And also, let's just go forward a few frames and see what the defaults do. I know that they're going to be way off. Okay, so at frame 24, let's check this visualize turbulence. And again, we have that issue where the streamers are really dense. So you could go in there and change that if you want. Might as well allow editing. Let's go figure out where that, here it is, this vector field visualization is. Override and do this sort of thing again. Okay, so with turbulence, what you want to do is you want to take the swirl size really high. So let's go to a value of, let's say, 5 to start. Let's also change the voxel size as we test this to something more coarse. So let's go forward 27 frames now. And what we're trying to do in general is give a really big swirl size that just sort of pushes things gradually over time. So see how we have these big shapes? That's a good thing. Let's take this turbulence up right here. I like taking this to about a value of 5 as well. Let's also turn up the grain. That'll add just a little bit of smaller detail to the individual strands. This will also increase the scale of the effect. The scale meaning how intense are the velocity vectors being pushed. And then also, let's take this pulse length. I think 0.5 is good for now. Let's actually go to the scale and say something like 0.02. So something very subtle. Now, actually, I would like to just re-emphasize something here. With turbulence, turbulence can destroy your entire fire simulation if you add too much of it. And I see this happen a lot. Somebody might have a great pyrosim, but as soon as they add the turbulence in and they make this too intense, then all you're really seeing in your velocity field is turbulence, and it's not temperature that's really driving the simulation anymore, it's turbulence. So don't be the person that does too much gas turbulence. Use this very lightly and try to achieve just a gradual wind over time. Speaking of which, let's take this pulse length up just a little bit, 0.75, so that it moves a bit more slowly. And notice how, as I look at these velocity vectors, we're in the purples and the blues. We're not in the reds, the greens, any of that, right? So we just want a very subtle effect on the velocity vectors. Now that we have that, let's uncheck Visualize Turbulence. Let's now look at our velocity vectors for the entire simulation. So we'll go right here. And now let's go forward about 35 frames and see what's happening. Okay, so now we have something like this. And I could probably already tell you that maybe we're going too intense on the turbulence. But as you can see, by adding in this turbulence, we're affecting these areas that live outside of the flame in the temperature fields. And that's a good thing because as our flame and our temperature moves into new air, that space, that, area that doesn't have temperature or flame, it's moving. It already has some kind of velocity vector, and it's not just at a standstill. That'll really help break up the shapes of your flame, and it's just going to mimic what real life does just a little bit better than if these velocity vectors were doing nothing. So anyway, turn off this velocity here. If we have our multi-field, notice how we probably have too much turbulence because our shape is being defined primarily by the turbulence. It's not good. So let's go over here, change the scale to 0.015. And then I'll turn up the resolution to this. So I'll go to 0.01 on the voxel size, and let's see what this does for the sim. Okay, and now we have this. So in my opinion, this is probably a bit too much turbulence. I'll dial that down. And also, when it comes to the actual scale of the turbulence, it's probably a little bit too small. Generally speaking, if I was to visualize how much a swirl of turbulence ought to be, I want to think about maybe that. So about 75% of the actual fire pit is about the size of one swirl. I don't want the swirls to be too large because if the swirl is larger than the actual pyrosim itself, it'll make it look like the entire flame is just moving from left to right, and that doesn't look very natural. But if we go maybe about 75 to 50% of the size of the entire pyro effect, that'll be about the right size as far as the swirl scale goes. So let's fine-tune those things, and then we'll do this one more time and move on to something else. Okay, so back here again, let's visualize turbulence. And yeah, it looks like we just need to get a little bit larger on that swirl size. So let's say a swirl size of 6, maybe even 7. Swirl size of 7. So we'll go right about that. Let's turn down this grain just a little bit. And then let's also go to the scale, and then let's say 0.01. So right about, well, maybe less than that, 0.0075. All right, and just so you know, I did recache that, but I went back and I changed just a couple of more settings. Depending on your scene, these settings will change, so you'll just have to adaptively figure out what numbers work best. I found a scale of 0.01, and generally speaking, that swirl size of 7, grain of 0.598, and a pulse length of 0.5 seemed to give the right combination that I liked. And after that was set up, we end up with this. And actually, I'll do 30 frames per second right here. Eventually, we will speed up the frame rate here. So anyway, there you go. That's turbulence. Use sparingly, but if you have just a little bit in there, this will add a very nice subtle effect to what you have going on. Okay, so now that we have that, let's now move on to smoke, aka density, and also talk a little bit about divergence.